listener production. Hey, welcome to this episode of The Briefing. Sacha, Barbour, Gatt with you. And yes, the highly anticipated third season of White Lotus has dropped today. And fans are preparing to salivate over the characters, the sets, the storylines, the themes, and of course, the all-important location, Koh Samui in Thailand.
สวัสดีค่ะ Welcome to the White Lotus in Thailand ค่ะ
Our hotel is the best in the world.
To Thailand and a week of new memories.
Gluten-free rice and coconut balls? What are we at a f***ing fat farm?
The show has managed to make a main character out of wherever it has filmed, Maui and Taormina so far, with the destinations becoming insanely popular following the release of each season. The 4 seasons Maui saw a 425% year-on-year increase in website visits after the drop of season 1, while searches for Sicily increased by 350% while season 2 was airing. And Thailand is already seeing the so-called White Lotus effect with a double-digit boost in travel demand. So while cashed-up tourists plan to live out their White Lotus fantasies in far-flung places, what impact is the show's insane popularity having on over-tourism and the lives of locals? And should we be thinking harder about being a good tourist before dropping our own cash on a trip to Thailand? Australian Traveller's Quentin Long is joining me now to talk about it. Quentin, welcome back to The Briefing. Thanks so much for joining us today. Look, we're here to talk about White Lotus and its impacts on tourism, and it did become such a cultural phenomenon after airing during COVID. Now, the 4 seasons in Maui in Hawaii was the location of this incredible series. Did people flock to the island after the show dropped? Was that interest kind of immediate as soon as it was airing, or did they have to wait because there were travel restrictions?
So, look, Maui was obviously still recovering from impacts of the fires, which was really sad, but they did see a massive surge in numbers as soon as the popularity of the show got to a stage where it really became, water cooler conversation, and suddenly people started converting. And it's really interesting if you think about how that converts in terms of the story. It's not all a beautiful narrative arc and it celebrates. It's actually got some dark sides to it, but it shows you the beauty of great cinematography, or even though this is for a TV show, and showcasing a destination and getting people to aspire to be there. White Lotus season 2 did exactly the same for Taormina in Sicily. When I was there, it was elbows to elbows, and that was in May. So early in the season, lots of people in Taormina and all trying to replicate some of those experiences that, again, another 4-season hotel in Taormina. Interesting also, Sacha, was that the first season really focused on just the hotel. Everything took place within the hotel. In the second season, we got some more destination exposure. And so it did actually have a more dispersed effect around the whole of the Sicily as opposed to just Taormina.
And the location does become a main character on the show, I think. I think that's something that is really unique to White Lotus, at least in recent kind of pop culture where they are is part of the story. Is that the key then from the tourism perspective, where it's like we see so much of it that we want to go there ourselves?
Yeah, like you got to remember that this is over an extended period of time. Like, 10 episodes? That's a lot of exposure. That's a lot of time, particularly when it is about the idea of being on a leisure trip, right? So it is about the destination that attracts people. That's the narrative. And that narrative becomes incredibly important to the story as it progresses. So it's a lot of exposure over a long period of time for people, which obviously leads to a lot of people want to be there. I think there is precedent on this, though. I would argue that New York was a character in Sex and the City, particularly Manhattan. And, that milieu that they're in over several seasons does actually make people really familiar with the destination. So when they turn up, they start to feel like it's really something they've experienced before, and they start to walk around and go, oh, that's where, this character did that, or, all those sorts of things happen. So I think the destination as character is really a critical piece to the overwhelming success of these as tourism bodies.
I want to talk about then the hotels, because My thought is if they were filming White Lotus in a backpacker hostel, would it have the same impact on tourism as it has filming at these incredible resorts that are thousands of dollars a night? Like, would we have the same pull if they were staying somewhere that was maybe 2 stars instead of 5?
I think the short answer is absolutely not. But the more nuanced answer is, look, aspiration drives a lot of people's ideas around travel and tourism. They want to go and see it. They may not be able to do it at that level, but when you see it at 5-star, incredible level, you then come down. Whereas it's really harder to do the reverse, which is see it at 2-star. That's not very aspirational. It doesn't have the same effect on people. So I totally agree. There's a great thing about the idea of aspiration is it inspires people, but they don't have to replicate it as much. I would argue that White Lotus is different because it is so hotel-centric. But when you get to much more destination-driven things like Sex and the City or Game of Thrones, for example, those sorts of things, whether it is about the destination, that aspiration is very much part of the whole experience and actually leads to tourism booms that are beyond just the single property.
And that's all well and good for us to sit at home in Australia and go, oh, I would love to go to Taormina. I'm going to go do it. And like you said, you went. I don't know anyone who's been to Italy in the last 2 years who hasn't gone to Taormina. How do locals feel about that? Like I said, it's all well and good for us to be like, yeah, we want to go there and we want to live out our White Lotus fantasy. But the locals are the ones who are there day in, day out dealing with these annoying tourists.
Interestingly, in both destinations so far in seasons 1 and season 2, and I'll get to season 3 in a sec, but in both destinations, like particularly Maui, they're used to tourism. That's part of their DNA. That's their ecosystem. So that's okay. Taormina, slightly different because it is a smaller medieval town that is gorgeous, right? They do understand that tourism is a huge part of their things and they live with it as best they possibly can. I think Koh Samui is going to be interesting because it is a massive destination and there's been a lot of effort to try and make that a little bit more sustainable. And I'll be interested to see how that goes down with the local tourism authorities and whether they can balance that out. Because as we all know, there's this great surge in tourism across the world as people get more wealthy and the cost of travel goes down. And we're actually trying to face and sort out what over-tourism, as like everyone likes to call it, means. And I think this is going to be something that we see play out over the next couple of years in Koh Samui again.
Yeah, well, let's quickly talk about Koh Samui, which is the location of season 3, and it has already seen a spike in tourist numbers, even just after it was announced that Koh Samui was the location, which is fascinating. I've been to Thailand a few times and it's changed so much over the 20 years that I've been going there. And one of the big focuses for Thailand tourism, especially around the islands, is trying to stem the impacts of over-tourism. So that's things like rubbish, that's things like people walking on islands. You know, they've built boardwalks where you can't go on the sand anymore. You can't swim at certain places because they're trying to stamp out what we've seen happen to those beautiful locations because tourists just want to go there and spend time there. Is this potentially going to undo a big chunk of all that hard work when we're getting this influx of people wanting to go to Koh Samui?
In a word, yeah. I mean, that's the real danger here for the destinations. But I should say, in season 3, there are 3 major destinations. Obviously, Koh Samui is the biggest one, but there's also Phuket and Bangkok. And I think in this particular instance, it's going to be really challenging to understand how they deal with it. I do think what you'll see is a growth in the region. So, for example, just north of Koh Samui is Koh Phangan, which is an amazing destination, gets very little profile compared to Koh Samui, even though everyone knows it for its full moon party, but that's a completely different set of visitors. But that's probably where you'll see the dispersal effect. And I think that's where they'll try and flow people into other destinations that are just as amazing, but not as much high profile.
Yeah, I'm wondering what you think about the lure of tourist dollars to local tourism agencies and governments when, you know, I mean, they'd have to get permission to film and to have all those permits approved. Do you think that lure of tourist dollars off the back of something like White Lotus filming in your country or in your province is too much to ignore when you're kind of trying to balance the needs of the environment and the locals versus making some money?
Yeah, to answer that question comes down to the individual destinations. And it really is the biggest threat to tourism globally at the moment is how do governments generate, and the beauty of visitor economies is that they are regenerational in terms of you can sell that bedroom 365 days a year, this year, next year, and forever. And so that's really, really helpful, and it has such profoundly positive effects for local economies. And then when it gets into over-tourism, it becomes a really degrading on the environment. And so it does become that balance. And in reality, what we end up with is some destinations that go too far in the over-tourism and end up in over-tourism and degrade it, and other destinations that are actually holding that back. And that's why you see, just to use another case study, is Indonesian government's trying to create 7 other Balis, and they're doing them using all the lessons of Bali to create these next destinations that will not have any of those issues. And I think that's probably where you'll see places go.
We were talking before we hit record, in my mind, I'm like, oh, White Lotus is doing it the best. I can't think of anyone doing it better. But you were like, actually, there's heaps of references in pop culture since the 90s at least that we referenced when we were talking off air that have had the same sort of impact on tourism. Talk us through some of the shows and movies that we've seen in the past that have actually done the same thing that White Lotus has been doing.
Yeah, so obviously, big one in our region. If you go way back into the 80s, Crocodile Dundee did it for Australia. And then the advertising campaign that followed that was the conversion point on that, and really got it mainstream Australian culture into particularly the American market. And then you follow that up in our region with Lord of the Rings, which was just such an incredible positive for New Zealand tourism, and they're still seeing the effects of that, and they still have people who turn up and do Hobbiton, which is actually a destination where they filmed it, and it's now turned into a tourism product. And you have people that do Lord of the Rings tours around Queenstown, and they get the stills from the movie, and then they look at the landscape and they match it up. So it's been going on for a long time. Star Wars is another one. When they put out the last Star Wars, the islands off island where, Luke Skywalker is his last resting place, that became a huge hit, which I think was called Skelly St. Michael's or something like that. Then we've got Game of Thrones, Dubrovnik, Ireland again. Even things that you don't think would be destination impacting. I'll give you an example in the Australian context. Top End Wedding showed off the top end in the NT, did fantastically well, helped elevate the destination. Paddington, British tourism gets right behind Paddington because it's so quintessentially British. They even get behind 007 because it's so quintessentially British. And so it becomes destination culture, and putting those together actually is what tourists, travellers are looking for. So we've been doing it for a long, long time. There's one that I think is interesting is The Hangover. Is that really good for the destination? Well, it leans into what it's good for, right?
Yeah.
And so in different ways, anything that shows off a destination, even when it can be slightly not so positive, can actually show off a destination.
Quentin, before we let you go, over-tourism is such a problem these days, people flocking to the same places. We all see the same things on social media or on TV or on the big screen, and we go, we want to go there. Is White Lotus just kind of making it all worse? Can we blame White Lotus for a portion of this over-tourism issue that we're seeing, at least in the places that it's filming at?
Yeah, I think you can in the details of like that destination, Taormina specifically. Maui, I don't think as much because Maui is a built tourism environment, and Koh Samui, again, we'll have to wait and see. But I do think the over-tourism questions is going to be massive for the next 10 to 15 years. There's 2 possible outcomes here. And the first one is, if we believe travel is a democratic right or is a right of people, then we'll end up with some of these destinations having to have lottery systems where lotteries and you get to go and see it or not. The second, which is probably already happening, which I don't think is great, but is the reality, is that it becomes the domain of the wealthy, and that we let market mechanisms decide who does what, and therefore it becomes so expensive because demand's so high. You get the Chinese middle class, then you get the Indian middle class all travelling around the world, and suddenly it becomes just the domain of the wealthy. There are counter-arguments to that, and that is that they will learn to throttle it and, counter season and then dispersal. But my argument is, I'll give you an example, Europe. Europe does not really have a low season anymore. It has shoulder seasons, sure, but it doesn't have a low season. And so that's why you're starting to see those effects. And I just stretching that forward, I think you'll see a lot more challenges around very popular global destinations like the Trevi Fountain, where they're now limiting the amount of people that go to the Trevi Fountain at any given time. And I think you'll see it happen a lot more.
Quentin Long, it's always a fascinating chat, always sparks my wanderlust just a little bit more. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Hey, Sacha, my absolute pleasure. You have a great day.
That was Australian Traveller's Quentin Long speaking with me there. And do you know someone who has fallen victim to the White Lotus effect? Why not send them this ep and make them feel really guilty about it? We'd also love to hear what you think about how the show has impacted tourism. Do you think it's a big deal or not? Join us in our broadcast channel on Instagram, Behind the Briefing, and have your say. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you tomorrow morning at 6 for the headlines and another deep dive.